I'm Tony Hicks and I work within the Welsh Government's Trade and Investment Division. And in there, I head up our network of international trade advisors who are based in different locations throughout Wales, across Wales. I think most of the companies on this call today already know who their local international trade advisor, or ITA as we use that acronym. But if you don't, then please let me know and I'll arrange for you to be connected with your geographical international trade advisor. Today's workshop is part of a series of 4 webinars, workshops that we're focused on some of the key aspects of exporting. Earlier this week, we held a session on the growing importance of e-commerce as a way of facilitating exports. And after today, we have 2 further sessions planned, both taking place in early December. On the 2nd, we've got a workshop on identifying and exploring routes to market. And then on the 10th, we've got a webinar workshop on identifying and managing risk around exporting. And obviously that's it's important anyway, but it's particularly important in these weird times that we find ourselves in and not actually being able to travel, which is a fundamental part of exporting, as we all know. So if any of these further sessions are of interest to you, then please register via the events finder on the Business Wales website, as I think you've probably done for this particular workshop. You've just heard from Bill, and I'm very pleased that we have engaged the services of one of our long-standing delivery partners in Kinetic Cube in helping us deliver this series of workshops. We've worked with Bill and Tony and their team at Kinetic for many years, so I'm really looking forward to learning some new things myself from this morning's sessions, gentlemen. Just before I hand over to Tony, can I remind everybody, Bill's already alluded to it, about the need to keep your audio turned off throughout, as this obviously helps with the flow of the workshop, as well indeed as connectivity. But feel free to leave your video on if you want to do that. There's going to be plenty of opportunities to ask questions. I think this session is going to be interactive also, but I'll leave this to Tony to explain how he actually wants to handle this part of the workshop. And then lastly, as with all of our online events these days, we're very, very keen to obtain your feedback just to make sure that we are not missing anything, or we're not we're looking to improve on what we do online. So we will email you post the webinar workshop a short questionnaire. So please feel free to give us your feedback in there, good or bad. But obviously, if it's bad, we need to know about it so that we can rectify it for the future. So on that note, I'll hand over to Tony.
Thanks very much, Tony. It's Bill again here. I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping. The session's being recorded, so it will be available for people to view afterwards, or if you want to share with any colleagues. So you will get a link through for that. Questions, as Tony said, please put those in the chat box, and then we'll return to those at the end, and we can have some discussion around those things. Anything that we can't cover off in that session, we'll come back to you. I'll give a brief introduction to my colleague Tony in a minute, and be advised as well, we will be having some polling throughout the session. So companies, please do give us your thoughts. This is not a webinar with hundreds of people on, but just to get a sense of some of the polling questions will be quite useful for us to see where you're at in your various journeys. So select your new export market. That's what we're about to dive into. This is what we're going to cover off this morning. As Tony's already said, we're a long-term contractor to Welsh Government for export services. Our team members have been helping Welsh organisations to go international for over 20 years, and we've actually worked with, I'm sure it's well over that number now, but over 500 Welsh companies actually go abroad. So we've done a huge amount with Wales over the years. So we're going to talk about why export, where export, and talking about multi-stage market selection processes, and also about market validation as well. Our main speaker today is my colleague Tony Agarwal, who's got some 35 years experience of business development, 25 of those in international business. So very, very, very experienced person in terms of exporting and connecting people, opportunities and places all together. So with no further ado, I will hand you over to Tony to get started.
Thank you ever so much, Bill and Tony Hicks. A great pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm conscious of the fact that a number of you are exporters. I recognise your names, so I won't labour this point too much about why to export, but I think it's always good to remind ourselves why it is we're looking to export before we dive into where are we going to export. So why are we doing it? Just very quickly, obviously it's additional sales for us, it brings in additional revenues, but perhaps the most important reason for exporting is by exporting it makes you that much better than your domestic competition. It drives innovation, which in itself drives productivity, which in itself drives profitability, and it's a virtuous circle that goes on and on and on. So you can leverage what you do here elsewhere, and what you learn elsewhere makes you more competitive back home. So I have examples of companies we work with who may be small exporters in terms of their size, but by virtue of being able to say that they export, it makes them stand out in their home market. So it reinforces their arguments when they're selling either domestically or in export markets. It's all about improving competitiveness, and as one company said to me once, they feel a moral obligation to export. It is a duty to export. They owe it to their national economy to export. It's imperative that we as a country export, otherwise we'd have a payments crisis. So that's why, basically. And this is just some research which I won't labour on too long about how companies benefit from exporting. So it's not just it's not just anecdotal, there is actual hard evidence that shows those companies which export are financially stronger. When we talk about companies in the UK, we talk about the big companies who are leaders in the world, be it Rolls-Royce or be it retailers like Marks and Spencer's. They're strong because they export. So enough about that. We know that you're interested in exporting, so let us continue about where to export. Before you can export, of course, you need to be export ready, and that's the tricky bit. Some companies accidentally, wrongly think they're ready to export, and can end up finding themselves in a difficult situation. Being export ready isn't actually, it does take efforts, of course, to be export ready, and it may be like you're export ready for some regions of the world, but not for others. So typically when we're looking at companies, they will have a export journey where they would start off with low barriers to entry markets, places like Ireland or Europe. And we find that companies who are far more sophisticated will start to tackle markets which are more complex, harder to reach. But fundamentally, you have to be export ready, and by that we mean, is your business able to tackle the export markets? Do you have what it takes? Obviously, products and services which are competitive, but moreover, have you got the management resource to tackle this the exporting journey? And that also includes money as well to travel and to see things through. So it's a given that you're export ready as we move on to the key core of today's meeting, which is about how do you select your markets. So where to export? Now, we find that this is a common question for companies who are relatively new to exporting, but conversely, it's also an important question to those businesses which are at the opposite end of the spectrum, who are already well-established exporters, who've already are exporting to many markets, but are now looking for where else they can export to. So it's a very valid question, and it's an important question as well, in that if you choose the wrong markets, you could find yourself using a lot of valuable resource to chase markets which have very little potential. So let us step back and ask ourselves the question, how best to do this? So Bill's just asking on the polling here, how do you choose which market you're going to export to? So if you wouldn't mind just giving, just voting, please. So you could either react to client inquiries, or you could take recommendations from others, so something like you've heard from somebody else, or you can approach this process scientifically through a strategic selection process. So please, if you wouldn't mind just registering your votes now. Okay. Well, we're going to close the poll very shortly. Okay, I think that's fine. So reacting to client inquiries, which is what I would expect. So many of the businesses I see normally have a good idea of where they want to export. And the reason why that is often the case is for a small, medium-sized enterprise, they will be reacting to an inquiry and they'll want to know more about that market. So that's perfectly fine. Nothing wrong with that. However, you have to ask the question, is that the right choice for you? So let me just get out of that. So where to export? So obviously, wherever you export to, you have to make sure that whatever you're exporting is legally permissible. Otherwise, you can't export, very simply. But often you won't actually know whether it is or not a good market until you start to do some digging. Now, obviously, the fact that you may have had inquiries from a market is fine. It would suggest there's a market. And I describe those as reactive exporters who are reacting to those inquiries. So they've had an inquiry and they're reacting to that opportunity. You could argue that they're also accidental exporters as well. So they're reacting to those inquiries. And it may be that they are choosing markets on the basis of markets that they have heard about or have visited. So some companies may possibly be choosing markets because they've had some exposure to that marketplace, but it doesn't mean that that market is the best market for them. So I would like to speak to you this morning about looking at this scientifically, stepping back and asking the question objectively, well, where should we be exporting to? So I'm going to walk you through a process I often use for companies who are in that situation of not knowing where to look, or having some idea but not too sure and wanting to validate whether it makes sense. A process we use, which is a market selection exercise, which I'm going to talk to you about this morning. So where to export, you have the reactive or the strategic route. Let's go on to the strategic route. So I should just perhaps, well, I've spoken a bit about this, so let me move on. So how would we do this? If I was visiting your business, I would ask you, I'd work with you to understand which markets may make sense. So let's put together a long list, and that long list might be 5, 10, maybe a bit more, a number of markets that we can compare. So this is a market selection exercise, is a comparison exercise. Think of it as a tick list process. So you're asking lots of questions and then crossing out markets fundamentally which don't make it. Now, there are many questions that can be asked, and there are many ways of slicing and dicing this process. Typically, I would start off with a long list and divide it into 2 segments. One is the big picture, and the other is what is relevant to you. The way I prefer to approach this task is to make this process highly personalized to your business rather than just make it generic for any business. So the big picture side is very much a generic side. So what does a market look like in terms of size? Does it have buying power? You could look at growth rates in the industry, for example. What I find particularly helpful is looking for your competitors if they're there, but at the long list stage, that might be a bit difficult. It might make it too difficult. The long list is meant to be a way of whittling this down to a short list where you'll actually start to drill down in more detail. So it's very, very high level here. Let's not get into the weeds. So that's the big picture component. There's another component which is where it becomes personalized, which is what is important to your business. Now, for example, it could be languages spoken. So if you have people in your organization who can speak French or German, that might have an influence. But if the only language you can get by in is in English, then that would definitely skew your thinking. So you probably wouldn't target countries like China as an example. You need to stop and think about the value proposition. Where are you targeting? Is it high value or sort of more value orientated? So this will impact on your business. How far can you travel? Because obviously there's a limitation in terms of business development resources. Do you have the bandwidth? If the market is very complex, some markets in Africa, for example, they take a very long time, or South America, they take a long time to develop. You might want to think about what sort of markets you're looking for that fit your business capacity. And things like personal issues like safety and risks. Are you happy and comfortable going to places which might be very challenging for your personal well-being? I'd also say, and I try to make this objective as possible, are there any personal drivers why you're choosing a market? So it's quite common when people have been away on vacation that they've gone to Florida or somewhere like that, or Spain, they come back saying, you know what, I wish I could export there and make that a business decision. Well, as romantic as that would be, it's not necessarily a good idea. So just think about what it is that you need to make your business exporting a successful journey. So think about the factors, and I'm going to give you some examples today about the sorts of things to look at, but these factors could be anything you want them to be, okay? So let's try some of these factors here. So I've gone for a market selection process where we have 5 markets, markets A to E, and we start off with a big picture. So we have the market size, growth rates, is it growing? Are my competitors there? And so what I do is I would actually allocate a scoring to those. Now, I've assumed an equal weighting for all these factors, but you could give a weighting to any of these determinants, as I call them, because that might, give a heavier weighting to things which are more important to you. So what you have here are you giving numbers, a score, to those different factors by market. For big picture, and then the same for personal. So things like English, value, product compatibility, business development cost, safety, personal interest, etc. The problem you have with anything like this is whilst you're trying to be objective, is you're still being subjective in terms of scores you're giving. It is a big challenge, and you have to try and be as objective as you can. Maybe the way to be objective is to have a third party help you input those scores rather than you actually allocating. But in the absence of that, you just have to try and be as objective as you can. Think of it as akin to hiring new staff. You've got 5 CVs on the table, and you need to sift through them. how would you score them? And it's a similar process to this. Typically, what I find with the long list, step one in this process is that the scores tend to be clustered around two groups. So you'll have a group which is your priority group, 2 or 3 markets which are scoring roughly the same, and 2 or 3 at the bottom end which are way out. So what we're really trying to do with this, the purpose of this, is to give us that short list, because that's when we're going to dive into greater detail. So this is simply the first sifting part of the process. Let me go on now to where we go with our priority markets as a born out of this. As you can see from this, the priority markets are D and A. Now, it would appear that market D is the go-to market. Well, let's hold fire before we decide it is. But certainly market D and market A are the two that we should be looking at in greater detail. Whereas markets B, C and E are all roughly much of a muchness, but the next level down. So the next step would be to look much closer at markets A and market D. So this is where we go for a deeper dive. So now we really want to sort of drill in, dig deep into the weeds and understand more about these markets. Remember, step one was very much a high level overview, not any depth as such. Now we're going to drill in. So we want to understand things about the markets at a generic level, much more. Is it stable? Is it friendly? Is it going to be a place where it'll be easier for us to do business? Does it have a good track record on payments? Is it easy to get to? If it's somewhere it's difficult to get to, then it's going to be problematic. Can you get by in English, or will you have to invest in more resources? And what are the risks of doing business with that marketplace? Now, I think we'd all agree when we look at generics, we'd probably say for a market like the United States, yeah, tick, 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 tick. United States, dead easy. Definitely makes it. On this particular part, generics, yes, it does. Now, then let's get to specifics which are specific to your business. So what does the market of your business look like? Is there a lot of competition? How's that marketplace served? Are there lots of regulations, obstacles getting in your way? What are your competitors there? Is there a strong domestic market already in terms of competition? What sorts of pricing? So we're really beginning to drill down. What might the next steps be? What sorts of things would you be doing to actually look at that market? And this is where, if you're looking at the United States, for example, it definitely passes the generics test. But when it comes to the specifics, it might be more challenging. So this is why with step one and step two, we've had things which are generic and things which are specific to your personal business circumstances. So to answer the specifics, you need to do a lot more research. There are lots of resources out there. The internet today provides us with so many places to look at. There are also very many LinkedIn groups, chat groups, etc., where you can get more information. The challenge you're going to have is for many businesses, your tier 3, tier 4 sort of level, and the information you need isn't readily available. Or if it is, it's very it tends to be not specific enough to you. So it's very hard to go. You can go so far, but going beyond that, it gets very difficult, because often many of the businesses we come across today are global in their nature, but are very niche. So there might only be 5 or 6 companies in the world who provide something very similar to that. So as a result, it's very hard to find information. But you go as far as you can with this particular area to understand what is going on. I think it's really important, if you have competitors, to look at your UK competitors for sure, to see what they're doing. That will give you lots of insight in terms of if they're there, what are they doing, how are they doing things. If they are not there, why are they not there? Is it something that you have missed, sorry, that they have missed, or is it because they decided it's not for them? So those are the most obvious telltale signs to look for. So that is absolutely a key area to look at. Now, again, you can only go so far at desk-based level because that's what step 2 essentially is, okay? So we move on to the validation points here now. How do you validate your markets? So we've already got an idea. We have our priority markets from our shortlisting. We have some assumptions that we put down here. We now need to test this out. Now, as Tony Hicks reminded us at the outset, validating the market would normally be done by traveling to the markets. Obviously, with COVID, that makes it challenging right now. However, things like you can do, and I've alluded to those already, is look for industry associations. Often you'll find associations or conferences in the target market where you'll be able to get a feel for what is going on. There will be export clubs as well. So you've got industry associations in our country, like the SMMT, Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, who will be looking at export markets. You'll have similar associations overseas. You'll have our own export clubs, the South Wales Chamber, for example. But that still isn't enough. Typically, you would have to go and visit a market to engage with the market to understand how it functions. As you begin to move down that road, this is where the costs start to ratchet up, because this is where you will need to start to visit a market. Clearly, at the moment, that's difficult. But traveling to a market to gather data and to check assumptions is difficult. It's going to have to happen, but when you do start to go out to do that, that is where I have some suggestions. But I'm going to let Bill ask you for which process you would normally go for with your market selection, and then we'll talk about the sorts of things in terms of validating. Now, this is very interesting on the polling. Very, very interesting. Okay. So in terms of the polling, it suggests that most of you would approach the market strategically. And that is, yep, so let's go with that. So that's slightly different to the question that was asked at the beginning, which was about how do you decide which markets to export? Because the answer there was the preference was for choosing markets by addressing inquiries. So what we're now getting is a shift in terms of people saying that they would choose their markets by strategic selection processes. Now, what to do in terms of validating markets? Words of advice in terms of how to do this. If you're going to visit a market, plan your visit carefully so that you should be planning to visit a market for a number of days, reaching out to see a variety of people, walking around, seeing things in your industry. A trade show is obviously a good place to start, or a conference if that's possible. Go and visit the embassy or overseas post of the UK government. Welsh Government may well have an office in the market you're targeting. I'm a great believer in having a walk around and talking to customers to see what they have to say, to get their reaction, finding distributors and so forth to understand how they view the marketplace, because I think that information you gather will certainly help you to understand how a market appears for you in terms of what the characteristics and dynamics are. It will help you gather that intelligence to come back home and develop your strategy further. The biggest mistake that you could make is to rush straight into a market and realize it's a market that in the end is not the market for you. We've seen too many examples of people going to markets without a great deal of thought, entering into relationships which ultimately prove to be damaging, because there's a lot of energy is wasted and expended on these sorts of ventures which don't make sense. So the best exporters will want to approach the task scientifically and take their time rather than rushing in. But the validation process is so critical to actually gather the data you need. Don't just run in and take a decision based upon what you have seen just from a desk-based exercise. So on that note, I think we have a little bit, sorry, my power's running out. I'd like to ask Bill for some more polling, please. Okay. And I think that this polling source vindicates what I've just said, that if you fall into a market by accident, it can, it can be okay, but it could be better if you approach this scientifically, stop, pause, and think about what you want to do and how you're going to do it. So I'll just stop the polling if I may. So key takeaways, obviously make sure you're export ready, put together a manageable list of markets, and this is an area I want to come back to in a moment. What does that manageable list of markets look like? And then go through a screening process I've described, shortlist the markets and drill down further. But fundamentally, you have to validate the markets. And the only way you can do that is by engaging with the markets. I suggest you just go for one market because it is costly. You need to spend time visiting, and it will probably require a second visit as well. So getting the starting point right is very, very important. So if I may get back to the manageable list of markets, I know people often ask me, how do you choose that manageable list? Is it by a diverse range of markets? For example, do we compare regions like Europe and Asia, or do we compare within a market like Europe? And that's a tricky question to answer, I guess. I think it's got to be markets which you feel personally comfortable with, that you can service. So I take you back to the personal side in terms of what is your capacity to deal with markets. So your capacity to deal with Europe versus Africa may be very different. So a key consideration is, what markets do you consider to be manageable for your needs? Let's just continue on. So we're at the Q&A section. Do we have any more polling, Bill? So I'd like to ask you for this. So for those of you who've approached the process strategically, how successful has it been? That's assuming you've. Okay, great. Okay. Equal. Okay, that's fine. Okay, so that's equal. That's okay, good. And then, so do you need to show results? There you go. Okay. Okay, so over to Q&A. So Bill, any questions, please?
Thanks, Tony. Obviously, we're into our Q&A session here. There's a few comments coming in. One question from Redithia. Is it easier to export to countries closer to home, for example, Europe instead of Asia?
Well, sorry, there's some background noise there. Is it easier? Well, it has been easier to export to Europe, but because of the freedom of goods and people. That's obviously changing very soon. I think the answer is very much, it depends upon your business. So for some businesses, we know that their products and services are better suited for markets where regulations might be different. Perhaps there may be lower barriers, regulatory barriers. So it really does depend upon the nature of your business. However, clearly, in terms of getting products and people to Europe, that has been easy, but it doesn't mean to say it's an easy market, if only for the reason that it's also a highly sophisticated and very competitive market as well. So I think it's down to, like all these things, it's down to your particular business.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Something else to throw in here. In your long experience of seeing all sorts of different types of companies export and all different sectors, you've seen great success, but we've also seen people make some mistakes along the way. What would you say are the sort of biggest pitfalls that an exporter can fall into? And I guess I'd split that into two. One, what mistakes do new exporters make, and what mistakes do experienced exporters make?
Good question. New exporters, I think often they underestimate how much effort it's going to take to develop an export market. So getting your market selection correct is very, very important, because if you choose a market which it's going to take too much effort, then you may not survive long enough, or you may just give up because you don't have the appetite to continue to see that through. So new exporters, I think for them, it's got to be, let me put it this way. If you're already exporting to 20 countries and country 21 turns out to be a bit of a bad experience, not great, but you can overcome that. But if you're exporting to country number one, or trying to export to country number one, and it fails, then it's very hard to absorb that failure. It can stop you in your tracks. So for new exporters, getting it right is absolutely critical. For experienced companies, I would suggest to you that they would be using more of a market selection exercise that I've walked people through. It's not the only way, of course, but using some sort of structure like that, where they're asking lots of questions and then putting it through a filter. I find that those sorts of businesses are very good at what they do, and they tend to fail less often. So they know what they're letting themselves in for, and their failure rate is far, far lower.
Okay.
Now, do they fail? Yes, some do fail, but those failures are not due to their wrongdoing. They're often failures caused by things which are outside of their control. A ban has been introduced. We've fallen out with a country politically, so things outside of their control.
Yeah, some things you can research in advance, and some things are shocks to the system.
Yeah, some things you just don't control. So we had companies looking at Iran and China, and due to the political environment in recent years, those markets have sort of slipped a little. Iran for sure, and China this year has had a bit of a hit given some of the embargoes and so forth placed on them.
Okay. Another question from the chat, Tony. What counts as a market? So, for example, somewhere like the USA, is that one market, or do we have to look at the US as multiple markets on a state-by-state basis?
Well, that's a very good question. And this isn't just for the US, by the way. This is for any market. So I could argue United Kingdom. Is that a market? Is it all UK, or would we actually segment? And probably we would. most of us would segment the UK market. If you're a Welsh business, you'd segment that by Wales, and within Wales, South Wales and Mid and North Wales. And then you'd segment England, Scotland, maybe that's too far, I don't know. So it's about, that is a final level, a final layer of detail which does need to be considered. That I would suggest would be step number 3, if you like, in terms of the detailing, in terms of where exactly, rather than just the big picture. So big picture would be US. Step 2 would be Eastern US. Step 3 would be Northeast New England, for example. So it's these levels of refinement which you're forever applying to give you that fine filtering process. And the more you think about it, the better chances you have of success.
Okay, so the message is do your research.
research, but you that research you can only go so far with the internet. At some point, you've got to get away from your laptop, go out into the marketplace and speak to real people in the industry, market test. And if that market testing is suggesting to you it's going to be challenging, then you have to go back to the drawing board and ask yourself why. Is it something you can? Is it something that it's worth tackling, or is it just not worth the trouble? And that's actually is a big issue. There is, don't continue down a road just because you decided at the outset you're going to do that. Do be cognizant of what you're finding and be willing to flex subject to the findings you have on the journey. Don't be rigid. Yes,
don't throw bad money after good.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay. And another question that's come in here, Tony. Is it good practice to expand into neighbouring markets after successfully entering one in a particular region?
Excellent question, and that perhaps takes us slightly away from market selection in a funny way. This is where you're selling well into a given market, so let us ask the obvious question: can you sell next door? And probably not always. Probably there's a good reason why you can. If your product is liked in one market, then the neighbouring market should make some sort of sense, assuming it has a similar profile. Examples of that for me would be things like Japan and South Korea. So many of the companies I know who target Japan, South Korea for me would be the next obvious market to look at. So there we're not talking about a proper market selection exercise as I've walked us through. You may start it off with that to take you to Japan in the first instance, but once you're there, the next logical jumping point would be South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, United States, Canada. So that sort of idea, yes. But it also comes with a big but. Brazil, Mexico, 2 very different markets. Or Brazil, Colombia, neighbouring markets, very, very different markets. So just bear in mind that neighbouring markets can also be very, very different as well. Language, culture, buying power, regulations, and so forth.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Another one that came up slightly earlier, just going back to the US again. If a company decides strategically to enter the USA, how best is this done given the sheer size and diversity of the US? Because this is a big beast. It's a big elephant to eat.
It's an enormous elephant to eat, absolutely ginormous. And there's a company, Kinetic Cube, have been targeting North America. And I can give you my own personal experiences. I've found we are often in danger of thinking of the US as being one big homogeneous market, just as people often think of the UK as being London. Everything is London, or everything in the US is New York. It absolutely is not. So I think it's about looking at if you're looking at the US, let's say, looking at places where your product or service has a market. And I don't even think this is by geography, by East Coast or West Coast necessarily. I think we're seeing a divide. So is your product or service more for a urban city type environment, let's say New York, in which case Chicago, Detroit, San Francisco, let's say. So that's not by geography of the United States, that's by segmenting it by type of location. But I would certainly start off with treating the United States in bite-sized pieces. In that scenario I've just given you, I'd start off with one city rather than going for all cities in one go. But if we stick with that example, Bill, I would have a market selection exercise in this particular case of, let's say, 10 big cities in the United States, if that's what it is I'm looking at. And then instead of country A, B, C, D, E, I'd have city A, B, C, D, E, and then comparing. So I start to make some inroads into city A, the first city, before I start to spread to the other cities. I hope that makes some sort of sense. It's you segment and select on the basis which makes sense for your business. One size market selection doesn't fit for all businesses and all markets. It's for you to determine what factors make sense for your particular business.
Yeah, I think there's lots of resources that we can go to for that. I mean, Tony's put into the chat box there regarding something from the Institute of Export, which we've used in the past as part of our market selection, is the doing business guides, and you can actually look at how the World Bank ranks various markets and countries in terms of ease of doing business. So if anyone's not familiar with that, Tony's put that link in the chat box there, which is it's useful to as a starting point. It might be the first column in your market selection matrix, and it's a very useful resource of information.
And things, the other sources could be the things like the CIA fact book that gives you some very high level information, the EIU corruption index. There are many of these things. The only thing I'd caution is that that's fine for the very beginning, step one, as I described. But at some point, you need to drill down into what is relevant to your business. So for me, those high level factors are mandatory, if you like, a yay or an A. Is this a place I can sell to? Yes or no? If it's a no, then disregard immediately. Is this a place with high levels of corruption? Kick out immediately. So those for me are, if you like, the big filters, but then you need to go through some very fine filtering to get what's right for you. And that the only way you can do that is by going to the market, speaking to those in your given marketplace to capture some of that richness, because you'll find it very hard to get that over the internet alone from available resources. But you must start with something. So that's a great suggestion from Tony.
Can I just add to that as well, guys? In that, once you've done that sort of high level and a little bit deeper dive research online, and you're beginning to formulate your strategies around where to look next, then the Welsh Government can help you, and indeed our colleagues in the Department of International Trade. We've got colleagues based in 21 overseas locations who are on hand there to help Welsh companies make the right decision in looking into markets. And they're very well connected with DIT officials, who of course are a much bigger resource. DIT, by that I mean the Department of International Trade. The UK government have got commercially focused teams based in virtually every market globally. So we can always bring those people to bear in helping you make some final decisions around which markets you look to target next.
Absolutely. And I if I may add to what Tony Hicks has just said, is when you are traveling to a market to validate, for me, they would always be a very good starting point, be DIT, and if there's a WG overseas office. to call in on them, but let them know in advance, please, because you do need to speak to the appropriate trade officer at DIT in the overseas market. And if you let them know in advance, they may be able to set up introductions to other people for you. It's a mushroom process. So, you know, you start off with 1, that becomes 3, that becomes 12, and so on and so on. So if you can let people know before you travel, do not wait until you get to the marketplace and then have that conversation about who else should I speak to, because they might not be available in your time window. But yeah, always for me, a good starting point in the absence of knowing anybody else would be to start there.
Okay.
Yeah, and another way in which we can help in the validation of new markets is, of course, our fairly extensive overseas trade missions program. But unfortunately, that's on hold at the moment due to COVID. So we're not actually physically going anywhere until the issue is resolved. But that is one way of going and exploring new markets in a supported way. So if there is a market that's new to you, you know, you've done some base research, but you need to get there, then one option is to go on a Welsh Government or, you know, a UK government trade mission as part of a delegation, because you learn a lot from other people who are more experienced on that as part of that delegation. And they can help you a lot in validating that particular market for you and tips. At the moment, we're doing things virtually. We've got a series of virtual export market visits, which I know Bill and Tony are well aware of, as they're heavily involved in those as well. And we've just been, well, we're currently in the process of helping companies look at 3 markets: Japan, Qatar, and what's the other one, Bill?
Singapore, is it?
And Singapore, yeah. So those 3. And also we do go overseas to strategic trade shows, such as, for example, ADIPEC, which is the oil and gas, the world's largest oil and gas show. We're doing something strategically, virtually around that at the moment, because you know, there's some good opportunities in that region for our oil and gas and engineering businesses. And Medica in the MedTech, Arab Health. These are some examples of trade shows which we're now trying to tackle virtually also, and they're good ways of establishing what level of interest in your product or service is in a market.
Okay, thanks, thanks, gentlemen. Just reviewing the questions in the chat box. I think we have covered off all of them at the moment. If there is anything else anybody wants to ask, you're welcome to unmute yourself, of course, and ask that question. If not, we are probably ready to draw to the close. We're just coming up on the hour mark. So that will be where we are at. I'm just looking to see anything else coming in at the moment, which it doesn't seem to be. So on that basis, folks, thank you very much for your participation and your interest this morning. We will be sharing information in the recording of the session afterwards if you want to share that with anybody else. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Tony, for that valuable insight. Much appreciated.
Thank you indeed.
Bye-bye.